At the conclusion of the debate, it was decided to send out of the town those whom age or infirmity incapacitated for fighting. Crigognactus's proposal was to be adopted only as a last resort, if the reinforcements still failed to arrive and things got so bad that it was a choice between that or surrendering or accepting dictated peace terms. So the Mandubian population, who had received the other Gauls into their town, were compelled to leave it with their wives and children. They came up to the Roman fortifications and with tears besought the soldiers to take them as slaves and relieve their hunger, but Caesar posted guards on the ramparts with orders to refuse them admission. That's a terrible thing. So all the normal townspeople are just left in the no man's land. They're too much of a burden on the garrison inside the town of Alesia. And the Romans don't want the headache either having to feed them or just the logistical headache of having to deal with it. So they're just sort of left in that no man's land. Women and children and completely innocent men who just happen to live in the wrong town at the wrong time. The story goes on. Quote, "Meanwhile, Commius and the other commanders arrived before Alesia with the whole of their relief force and encamped on a hill outside the Roman lines, not more than a mile away." So it really is on now. Next day, they brought out their cavalry and occupied all the plain, 3 miles long, it will be remembered. Their cavalry was moved away a short distance and posted on the slopes of the hill. As the town commanded a view over the plain, the besieged saw the troops who had come to their relief, and all crowded together in excitement, rejoiced and congratulated one another on their deliverance. Then they brought out their forces. So the Romans go from the besiegers to the besieged on both sides. It is definitely a worrying position for Caesar and the Romans to be in. They then brought out their forces, the Gauls that is, posted them in front of the town and filled the nearest trench with fascines and earth, ready for a sortie and all the perils it would entail. Caesar placed the whole of his infantry along the 2 lines of entrenchments, so that in case of need every man could know his post and hold it. He then ordered out the cavalry to battle. The plain was visible from all the camps on the surrounding hilltops, and the whole army was intently watching to see the results of the engagement. The Gauls had placed archers and light-armed infantrymen here and there among their cavalry to support them if they had to give ground and to help them meet our cavalry charges. These took a number of our men by surprise and forced them to retire wounded from the battle. Feeling confident that their cavalry was winning, since it was obvious that our forces were heavily outnumbered, the Gauls on every side, both the besieged and the relieving force, encouraged them with shouts and yells. As the action was taking place in full view of everyone, so that no gallant exploit and no act of cowardice could go unnoticed. The thirst for glory and the fear of disgrace was an incentive to both sides. They had fought from midday till near sunset, and the issue was still in doubt, when the German horse massed all their squadrons at one point, charged the Gauls, and hurled them back. When their cavalry broke and fled, the archers were surrounded and killed. The rest of our horsemen advanced from other points, pursuing the fugitives right up to their camp, and gave them no chance of rallying. At this, the Gauls who had come out of the town went back in, bitterly disappointed, and now almost despairing of success. After an interval of only 1 day, however, during which they prepared a great quantity of fascines, ladders, and grappling hooks, the relieving army moved silently out of camp at midnight and advanced towards the entrenchments in the plain. Suddenly raising a shout to inform the besieged of their approach, they began to throw fascines into the trenches, drove the Romans from the rampart with arrows and stones discharged from slings or by hand, and employed every other method of assault. Meanwhile, hearing the distant shouting, Vercingetorix sounded the trumpet and led his men out of the town. The Roman troops moved up to the posts previously allotted to them at the entrenchments, and kept the Gauls at a distance with sling stones, bullets, large stones, and stakes which were placed ready at intervals along the rampart, while the artillery pelted them with missiles. So a second desperate all-out assault at night from both sides by the Gauls. The generals Mark Antony and Gaius Trebonius, who had been detailed for the defence of this particular sector, reinforced the points where they knew the troops were hard-pressed with men brought up from redoubts well behind the fighting line. First proper mention of Mark Antony there. Shan't be the last. As long as the Gauls were at a distance from the entrenchments, the rain of javelins which they discharged gained them some advantage, but when they came nearer, they suddenly found themselves pierced by the goads, or tumbled into the pits and impaled themselves, while others were killed by heavy siege spears discharged from the rampart and towers. Their losses were everywhere heavy, and when dawn came, they had failed to penetrate the defences at any point. Afraid, therefore, of having their right flank turned by an enemy from the camps on higher ground, they fell back upon their remaining troops. The besieged lost much time in bringing out the implements that Vercingetorix had prepared for the sortie, and in filling up the first stretches of trench, and before they reached the main fortifications, heard of the retreat of the relief force, so they returned into the town without effecting anything. So a bit lax and tardy and careless from Vercingetorix inside Alesia there. Could have done better that night, could certainly have done better. Caesar continues. After this second costly repulse, the Gauls held a council of war. By calling in men familiar with the ground, they ascertained the positions of the higher camps and the nature of their defences. There was a hill on the north which had such a wide sweep that the Romans were unable to include it within the circuit of the siege works, and were compelled to place the camp there on a slight slope, in what would ordinarily be considered a bad position. It was garrisoned by 2 legions under the generals Gaius Antistius Reginus and Gaius Coninus Rebellus. After sending out scouts to reconnoitre the ground, the enemy commanders selected from their whole force 60,000 men belonging to the tribes with the highest reputation for courage, secretly decided on their objective and plan of action, and ordered them to begin the attack at noon under Vercassiovelinus, the Avernian, one of their 4 generals and a relative of Vercingetorix. Leaving camp in the early evening, he almost completed his march before daybreak, and ordered his troops to rest under cover of the hill after their hard night's work. When he saw that it was getting on for midday, he marched towards the Roman camp referred to above, while at the same time the Gallic cavalry moved up to the fortifications in the plain, and the rest of the army made a demonstration in front of their own camp. On seeing these troop movements from the citadel of Alesia, Vercingetorix sallied out with the fascines, poles, sappers' huts, grappling hooks, and other implements which he had prepared for the purpose. There was fighting simultaneously all over the field, and the Gauls tried every expedient, concentrating on the weakest point of the defences. They're really going all out now, the Gauls. Distributed as they were, along lines of such length, the Romans found it difficult to meet simultaneous attacks in many different places. They were unnerved, too, by the shouts they could hear behind them as they fought, which indicated that their lives were not in their own hands, but dependent on the bravery of others. It is nearly always invisible dangers that are most terrifying. Caesar found a good observation point from which he could follow the action in every part of the field, and sent help where it was needed. Both sides realised that this was the time, above all others, for a supreme effort. Yeah, absolutely, it was now or never. If the Gauls were ever going to defeat the Romans at Alesia, it was now, really. It was this day. The Gauls knew that unless they broke through the lines, they were lost. The Romans, if they could not hold their ground, looked forward to the end of all their hardships. In death, that is, obviously. The danger was greatest at the fortifications on the hill where, as said above, Vercassiovelinus had been sent. The unfavourable downward slope of the ground told heavily against the Romans. Some of the Gauls flung javelins, while others advanced to the attack with shields locked together above their heads, fresh troops continually relieving them when they were tired. All of them threw earth onto the fortifications, which enabled them to climb the rampart and covered the obstacles hidden in the ground. At length, when Caesar saw that his men were weakening and running short of weapons, he sent Labienus to their relief with 6 cohorts, telling him to remain on the defensive, if possible. But if he could not hold the camp by any other means, he must withdraw some cohorts from their position and counterattack. Caesar himself visited other parts of the lines, urging the men to hold out. On that day, he said, on that very hour depended the fruits of all their previous battles. That's a great image again, isn't it? Caesar, you can imagine, running up and down the battle line, cheering his own men on, urging them on, goading them on as best possible. Morale is all important in decisive moments like this. He continues, the besieged Gauls despaired at last of penetrating the huge fortifications in the plain and attempted to storm one of the steep ascents. Carrying there all the implements they had provided themselves with, they dislodged the defenders of the towers with a hail of missiles, filled the trenches with earth and fascines, and tore down the palisade and breastwork with their hooks. Caesar first sent some cohorts to the rescue under young Brutus, then others under the general Gaius Fabius. Finally, as the struggle grew fiercer, he led up a fresh detachment in person. These troops renewed the fight and succeeded in repulsing the attack. So, Caesar right on the front lines with them, perhaps even getting personally stuck in himself with sword and shield and spear. Caesar now started for the sector to which he had sent Labienus, taking 4 cohorts from the nearest redoubt and ordering a part of the cavalry to follow him. Another detachment was to ride round the outer lines and attack the enemy in the rear. Labienus, when he found that neither ramparts nor trenches could check the Gauls' furious onslaught, had fortunately been able to collect 11 cohorts from the nearest posts, and at this moment sent to tell Caesar that he considered the time for decisive action was at hand. Caesar put on speed to get there in time for the fight. The enemy knew that he was coming by the scarlet cloak which he always wore in action to mark his identity. Great image. And when they saw the cavalry squadrons and cohorts following him down the slopes, which were plainly visible from the heights on which they stood, they joined battle. Both sides raised a cheer, which was answered by the men on the ramparts and all along the entrenchments. The Romans dropped their spears and fought with their swords. Suddenly the Gauls saw that the cavalry in their rear and fresh cohorts coming up in front. They broke and fled, but found their retreat cut off by the cavalry and were mown down. Sedulus, chieftain and commander of the Lemovices, was killed. Vercassivelinus was taken prisoner in the rout. 74 standards were brought in to Caesar, and only a few men of all the large army got back unhurt to their camp. When the Gauls in the town saw their countrymen being slaughtered in flight, they gave up hope and recalled their troops from the entrenchments. Incredible stuff from the Romans, really. The relieving forces immediately fled from their camps, and if the Romans had not been tired out after a long day's work, during which they had been repeatedly summoned to the relief of hard-pressed comrades, the enemy's army might have been annihilated. As it was, a large number were taken or killed by the cavalry, which was sent in pursuit, and came up with their rear soon after midnight. The survivors dispersed to their homes. An incredible win for Caesar and the Romans, really. Completely heavily outnumbered on both sides along a front, effectively 14 miles long, or twice that, right? Being attacked on both sides on a front 14 miles long. So a 28-mile long battlefront, effectively, and completely outnumbered, and they still win. And Caesar, with his scarlet cloak, getting stuck in personally. It's great stuff. Okay, and the story rounds out. Caesar tells us this, quote, "The next day, Vercingetorix addressed an assembly." He's supposed to have said, "I did not undertake the war," he said, "for private ends, but in the cause of national liberty, and since I must now accept my fate, I place myself at your disposal. Make amends to the Romans by killing me or surrendering me alive as you think best." A deputation was sent to refer the matter to Caesar, who ordered the arms to be handed over and the tribal chiefs brought out to him. He seated himself at the fortification in front of his camp, and there the chiefs were brought. Vercingetorix was delivered up. A famous image, famous scene. Vercingetorix surrendering to Caesar. And the arms laid down. Caesar set apart the Aeduan and the Arvernian prisoners, in the hope that he could use them to regain the allegiance of their tribes. And the rest he distributed as booty to the entire army, allotting one to every man. He then went to the country of the Aedui and received their submission. Envoys from the Arverni waited upon him there, undertaking to obey any orders he gave, and were commanded to supply a large number of hostages. Some 20,000 prisoners were restored to the Aedui and Arverni. Finally, the legions were distributed in winter quarters. 2 legions and some cavalry were sent to the Sequani under the charge of Labienus, with Marcus Sempronius Rutilius under him. 2 were placed under Fabius and Basileus among the Remi to protect them from injury at the hands of their neighbours, the Bellovaci. Reginus was sent to the Ambravetti, Titus Sextus to the Bituriges, and Caninius to the Ruteni, each with 1 legion, and Cicero and Sulpicius Rufus were quartered in Aeduan territory at Chalons-sur-Saône and Macon to collect grain. So Caesar making sure he keeps the whole country quiet after that last great victory over Vercingetorix. Caesar himself decided to winter in Bibracte. When the results of this year's campaigns were reported in his dispatches, a thanksgiving of 20 days was celebrated in Rome. End quote.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.